My name's Holly Smith-Charles and I'm the Arts Council lead for Transforming Governance. I'm going to do a very quick bit of housekeeping and then hand over to Ian, who is leading the session today. So first of all, a visual description. I'm a white woman and I've got blonde hair in a ponytail and I'm wearing a sort of chunky, cosy white jumper as well. So thank you all very much for joining this workshop. It's part of our broader Transforming Governance programme, which is a kind of series of events that we're holding. They'll be running all through the year to support good governance and leadership across our funded organisations. Some of you will have already attended some of our workshops. This is our 6th one. If you didn't make them, or if you want to recap, the other 5 workshops are all available free online. If you search for Arts Council Transforming Governance, that should find it. And as well as the recordings of the workshops, you'll see the slides that were presented and some really helpful practical resources around each of the topics, as well as some case studies of good practice that I hope will be useful. We'll also be running a peer network for chairs of boards and oversight groups, and the registration for the kind of introductory sessions is now open, so do have a look at that as well if you think that would be useful. And then there'll be other activities happening throughout this year as well, so yeah, do sign up to our mailing list if you would like to find out more, if you've not already done so. I'll do a very quick bit of housekeeping. We ask that you keep your cameras off for the main session, just because it helps with the screen sharing, and our BSL interpreters are hopefully pegged to the top of the screen. So yes, if you keep your cameras off for the group session, but then when we go into breakout rooms, do, if you can, turn them on, because that'll be an opportunity for a smaller group conversation. There's BSL and captioning available to everybody. Any issues with that, do drop us a note and we can help with any access needs. And for this session, some of you, we've had it slightly different on each of the workshops, but the chat function will be switched on for this one. So what we'd recommend is that do put your questions in the chat, and what we'll do is after the breakout sessions, we'll spend a little bit of time answering the questions that we can, and any that we feel we need to go back to or that we don't have time for, we'll answer. We'll do written responses to those questions after the session. There is a slight change, which actually brings me to that point. Unfortunately, the guest speaker is poorly, so we won't be able to have the guest speaker, which is a pity, but that does mean we'll have a bit of time for a question and answer session during this workshop. And just in terms of format, there'll be the presented content, and I'm going to hand over to Ian in just a moment. We'll then have a short break. We'll have a slightly extended breakout rooms, and then, as I say, the Q&A at the end. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand over to Ian. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Holly. It's wonderful to be with you all, and thank you, Harry and Claire, for interpreting for us as well today. By way of introduction, my name is Ian Joseph. I'm the Managing Director of Trustees Unlimited. And in terms of describing myself, I would say I'm mixed race, early 50s, wearing glasses, and probably the least said after that, the better. So it's great to be with you. As I said, I run a business called Trustees Unlimited. We were set up in 2009 as a disruptor into the trustee recruitment market, initially set up by 3 organizations: the National Council for Voluntary Organizations, a law firm called Bates Wells Braithwaite, now known as Bates Wells, and a company called Russell, the longest established interim management company in the UK. And the reason we came together is we felt that boards were lacking cognitive diversity and really needed to recruit beyond their own networks. And so the whole raison d'etre of having diverse boards making better decisions is really baked into our DNA, which is partly why we're so excited to be sharing some thoughts with you today. As Holly said, we will have Q&A toward the end. And here is a basic outline of what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to do a formal presentation now for about 45 minutes. I hope some of this is going to be helpful. Well, I hope a lot of it's going to be helpful. And in its nature and content, I'm really intending to be very practical. I recognize that we have a lot of different organizations in the room, some perhaps larger, more well-resourced, some perhaps less so. And so it's going to be very hard to peg it for everyone's benefit, but I'll do my best to give you some practical tips that could be very, very helpful. So let's start. And before I kind of kick off and talk about spade work, whatever that means, fundamentally, boards are the creators and custodians of board culture, as well as being the people charged with ensuring the organization delivers against its objectives. And having, therefore, a competent and engaged and diverse board is really vital. And I can't stress how important that really is. But before we do anything and talk about, recruiting trustees and strategies for doing that, there is something about spade work. And I was looking at my garden yesterday, and it's a complete mess. I'm kind of dreading spring because it means I'm going to have to get out there and do a lot of digging. And that can be really hard and it can be really boring. But nevertheless, if I want to have a beautiful garden over the summer, I've really got to put in some work. And the same is true when it comes to recruiting trustees. You need to put in some real effort, some real work to prepare yourself for the campaign that is to follow. And so the first thing I want to talk about is the importance of really engaging your whole board in your approach to recruitment. And very often I've seen organizations, and I've recruited hundreds of trustees for all sorts of organizations over the years. And sometimes what happens is the charity will just rush straight into putting an advert, hoping that they're going to find some great candidates. And really what needs to happen before that is the whole board need to engage in the process. And this is particularly important if you're looking to broaden your trustee membership, perhaps into more diverse communities. I was working with a charity last year and I spoke to the chair and he said, we want to actually diversify our board. It was an environmental charity, not known for being diverse in terms of the composition of their boards. And that was all fine and good. And then we met with the trustees as a whole, and we asked them what they were thinking of and why diversity was important for them. And it was very obvious the whole board hadn't really engaged in that discussion before engaging us to help them find some trustees. And there's a real telling point there. Engage the whole board at the beginning of any process. The second thing is to reframe your thinking. And what I mean by that is, if I just stick on the theme of diversity, for example, sometimes as trustees, we might say, well, how do we become more diverse? But really the question should be, what is it about us that prevents people applying to us? And so it's thinking about your organization in a slightly different way. Perhaps it's challenging some of the assumptions that you already have. So I know that trusteeship is often perceived as an elitist activity or something for white middle class people, and nobody else should really tackle it. And so you need to start thinking even early on about how do you remove barriers to people applying. Similarly, talking about language and making sure that as a board you agree on what you mean when you're talking about different definitions, particularly as it relates to recruiting diverse trustees. And so people often talk about, for example, lived experience, and they equate lived experience with expertise in EDI, whereas in fact there are specialists that focus on EDI, and lived experience can mean something else. But as a board, you need to have these discussions before you put pen to paper, so to speak, so that you're all aligned in terms of what you're thinking. A really great opportunity before you go out to recruit is to take some time just to review some of the things that you're currently doing. So, for example, does your charity have a code of conduct for its trustees? Some do, some don't. Is it something you might want to consider? If you do have one, is it currently up to date? What about the charity governance code? Is that something that you have used to benchmark your own performance as a board? Do you know what the charity governance code is? Is this now actually a good opportunity to look at it and see how you're doing? And it doesn't need to be a very sophisticated audit. Before you go out into the market, just check and see if there's anything that you could learn. What about your induction process? Do you have that in place already? And I'm going to talk more about the induction later, because it's often something we forget, but actually we do a lot of hard work recruiting trustees only to potentially lose them once they've come in. And we don't want a revolving door. We want people to retain and be with the organization and do really, really well. So nominations committee, who is going to be leading the process? Have you discussed that as a board? Have you agreed who the trustees are? Who's going to chair that committee? Do you involve the chief executive or executive director if you have one, or artistic director? But who's involved in making those decisions, and to what degree do they have delegated authority? And the final thing I just want to say here in terms of spade work is more of a psychological point, and that is it's a journey with no final destination. Well, hopefully the destination is going to be you appoint some trustees. But my point is, sometimes it doesn't work as well as we hope. Sometimes we're looking to recruit more diverse trustees and we get it wrong in terms of the way we're communicating or the language we're speaking. And that's okay, because I really believe that we learn from failure. And if you're not failing, you're probably not trying hard enough. And so don't be afraid to fail. Be ambitious with your goal to recruit great trustees for your organization, because your beneficiaries really deserve it. So I'm going to talk about some practical points now. Having done some thinking about your organization, thinking about the board, what's the next step in terms of recruiting your trustees? And we often talk about skills audits, but I like to kind of zoom out and broaden that to thinking about board audits. So a skills audit, of course, you analyze the skills you have with your organization. You think about where it is you're heading strategically, and therefore what are the gaps that you need on the board to get you to the place you want to get to. And there are lots of tools, and if you just Google charity board skills audit, you'll find lots of great stuff. But a board audit goes a little bit further than that and considers things about behaviors. It considers things perhaps about diversity that aren't picked up in a pure play skills audit. And it talks about things like lived experience, which is equally valuable to an organization in its effective decision making as having an accountant or having a marketing person. So think about your board audit. Have you done that? Do you know exactly the sorts of people you're looking for? One caveat is that sometimes there isn't a specific skill set. We do just need some new trustees, in which case I would say be open-minded to the types of individuals that might come forward. So that's not to talk against themselves, but you need to know for your own organization what are the requirements. Secondly, consulting your governing document. And I know this sounds so straightforward, but it's amazing how many organizations I've worked with who have gone headlong into recruiting trustees without consulting their memorandum and articles or their governing instrument, which will really dictate how you appoint and recruit trustees. So, for example, do you have to do that at an AGM? Do you have members beyond sort of being company members? Can you co-opt individuals? How long do they serve on the board for? And all these things will typically be enshrined in your governing document. I was doing a talk a while back, and I had a group of chairs in the room, and there were about 50 of them. And one of the chairs said to me, "What is my governing document? And then where do I find it?" And then I did a straw poll and said, well, how many of you chairs in the room have read your governing document? And only about a third of the hands went up, which was a bit of a shock to me. So make sure you've read your governing document and you know what it is you're supposed to, what you can and can't do when it comes to recruiting trustees. Consider having an open recruitment process. The latest statistics are that only 10% of vacancies for trustee boards are ever advertised in the public domain, which means 90% of board appointments are made in a different way. And that different way has to be through one's own network. And I'm a real pragmatist. I think there are times when that's really important, but we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't open our opportunities up to a much wider talent pool. And that need not be expensive. And I will suggest some things to us a little bit later that you might consider as a way of addressing that. Removing barriers. I've seen with lots of trustee recruitment candidate packs language that I don't think is very helpful. Now, a caveat, if you are looking to recruit a chair of an organization, you probably do want to have somebody with prior board experience, possibly even chair experience. However, do you have to have that, I guess, is the question. And I've seen trustee candidate packs and personal specifications written in such a way where board experience has to be required. You've got to have a degree. You've got to have senior sector experience, whatever that means. You've got to be high caliber. And all these things can potentially act as barriers to prevent really good people from applying to your organization to be a trustee. So I think it's just worth considering some of these things. Even the gendered language, whether it be chairman or chairwoman or chairperson or chair, just think about how this is interpreted by the people you're reaching out to. And just on the point of removing barriers, there's a real push across the whole charitable sector to appoint younger trustees. At the moment, young trustees are woefully underrepresented on boards, and yet they can add such tremendous value. So what about the paying expenses? Is that really enforced? What about the times of the board meetings? What about childcare and covering that for individuals? So some things to consider in terms of removing barriers and being open to young people joining the board or people joining a board for whom this is their first time. Have you considered, if you're a slightly larger organization, having a shadow board or an advisory board, or considering asking people to join subcommittees, not as trustees, but as members of a subcommittee, and perhaps they could spend a year getting to know the organization, offering some of their tangible skills, and then they become a trustee at a later date. So there's all sorts of ways you can approach this. So let me talk now a little bit about the key features of a really well-run trustee recruitment process. And again, I recognize there is no one solution fits all. And what I'm drawing on here is, years of experience recruiting lots of trustees and seeing what works and what doesn't. But a few practical points that I hope will be helpful. The first thing is about having a really good advert and or candidate pack to accompany your recruitment process. And the reason I think this is important is people have a very short span of engagement. It feels like increasingly people's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. And so you need to have something that's compelling, something that makes people really engage with what you're doing. And I think if you can perform the art of a storyteller and sell the narrative of your organization in such a way that people read it and the hairs on their arms stand on end and they feel like, I really want to engage with this organization, I'm so excited about the journey that it's on, I think you're halfway there to being really successful. So having a really good candidate pack or an advert, perhaps using imagery, things to watch out for, language we've talked about, things to make sure you include, being really clear on process and dates. And whenever you run a trustee recruitment campaign, my suggestion would be to treat it like a project management plan. So you have very clearly stated, this is the date we're beginning the campaign. This is the date that it ends. These are the dates we're having interviews. These are the dates perhaps where we're having conversations with the chair informally. These are the dates where we're having maybe a visit to the theatre or the gallery or whatever it is that you have. But all these things are very clearly laid out in the advert or candidate pack right at the beginning. That provides real reassurance to the potential candidates. Quite frankly, it also helps you as an organization be really organized. One of the toughest things about recruiting trustees is having the existing trustees agreeing on the timetable and setting aside time to be in a room together, whether it be virtually or in person. And so planning it out, really helpful. The other thing I would say about advertising is be really specific about the skills you're looking for. And if you are looking to broaden the diversity of your trustee board, be really explicit in your candidate pack or advertisement about what you're looking for, really specific. And that will just help people read that and feel like they're the right people to apply. Secondly, you want to have a good search strategy. Now, a lot of people come to us to be retained so that we can headhunt for them. And that's very successful. And in recent times, we've recruited, in fact, quite a few chairs for arts-based organizations. We're currently doing the chair for Siobhan Dance Studios. We've recently done the chairs of the Luton Culture Trust and the Roald Dahl Story Museum and Centre. But I recognize that headhunting comes at a cost, and a lot of organizations can't afford it. That's okay. There are lots of other things you can do, but you need to have a strategy. So consider 3 sites where you can post your vacancies. And I talked earlier about making sure that you're not one of the 90% who never advertise their vacancies. There are organizations such as Reach Volunteering, my own organization, Trustees Unlimited. If you're a small charity, you can advertise your role either free or very inexpensively. There's an organization called charityjob.co.uk that have a volunteer page. There's, if you're looking for finance people, there's an organization called ICAEW Volunteer. It's the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and they have a brilliant volunteer site. So if you're really wanting finance people, what a great place to advertise, and it doesn't cost any money. If you're looking for young trustees, the Young Trustee Movement has a LinkedIn group with hundreds of young people in it. You can advertise your vacancy there. Think about in your local area, Volunteer Bureau or CSVs. Again, many other ways to magnify or amplify the opportunity. Think about LinkedIn. Think about your own newsletter. Think about the your own social media output. But have it all coordinated so it all goes out on the same day and you know exactly where it's going. But there's no excuse not to promote your opportunity to a much wider group. Think about the application process. And I am a great believer that CVs are really helpful because it can enable someone to demonstrate a bit more personality than perhaps just an application form. But you probably want something more. You want a cover letter or a supporting statement that helps people not only address the requirements that you're looking for, but also the motivation and the reason why. Perhaps you might want to make applications more accessible and have people use videos or other forms of getting in touch. So think about how you want people to apply and for it to be really consistent. Think about your shortlisting process. Be really clear who is on the panel. As I said at the very beginning, as a board, you will agree who is the nominations committee, and to what extent they have delegated authority to make these appointments. You may want to have an odd number. If you have an even number, you may want to have someone that has a casting vote. But be very clear on the criteria that you're using to assess the different candidates. I've recently led a very high-profile process to appoint members as trustees of the Actors Benevolent Fund. It's been unfortunately in the news for all the wrong reasons. And so we had to be really specific on the criteria we were assessing the candidates on. We have a very clear audit trail of our conversations. Everything was written down, and we stand by the recommendations that we made, which thankfully were all accepted by the membership. But the point being, it was a very clearly thought through shortlisting process and an interview process, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So make sure it's clear and it's thought through. Don't just land at an interview and hope it goes well. With interviews, I do want to share just some points, again, from a psychological perspective, really. A balance has to be found, because interviews, it's not an inquisition. One has to be respectful. One has to have balance. One has to recognize that whilst we're recruiting people to a very important non-executive role, they are in the main normally volunteering. And so, a balance needs to be struck. You need to make sure your interviews are in a way that's accessible. So people, if you're doing them in person, can actually get there, can get into the room. The interviews describe the process and what's going to happen following the interview, and always be prepared to give really good feedback to candidates that are not successful. So again, think through the process of how you get people to apply, how you're going to shortlist, and how you're going to conduct the interviews. Also think with respect to interviews, very often a trustee candidate will want to have an informal conversation with the chair. They perhaps might want to have a meeting with the executive director or CEO. Think about these things at the very beginning of the campaign so that they're all in place. The first board meeting, I've seen some terrible mistakes made where people will interview candidates, appoint them, the candidate attends the first board meeting, and then the rest of the board wonder why on earth they've appointed that person. Or the candidate has willingly accepted to join the board and then regretted it at the end of the first board meeting. So something to consider, and this could be enshrined in your governing instrument anyway, is that when you want to make an offer and someone is really considering accepting, perhaps you could invite them to your board meeting as an observer, and they could be there. It's an opportunity for them to meet you, to interact with others, for the other trustees to meet them, and then both can go away and make a decision about whether to accept the offer or not. And then having a really good induction in place. And I'm going to talk in a little while just about some of the key things that make for a fantastic induction. So there's some of the features of a really good process. There are possibly some other things, but I believe they are the most important. Let me just talk a little bit about diversity, because I think this is something that's often talked about, but often not really understood. And one of the best definitions of why boards should have or should consider diversity is described in Holly Riley here, her quote, and I won't read the whole thing, but you can see what she says about charities having different perspectives, skills, and experience that help them anticipate challenges and consider new opportunities. All of this makes perfect sense. And in fact, there's been a lot of research done. So McKinsey is often quoted. Obviously, it pertains more to commercial organizations, but the principles are very similar. And McKinsey have found that companies who were more gender diverse, for example, were 15% more likely to outperform their peers. The same study found that organizations that were ethnically diverse were more likely to outperform their peers. The McGregor-Smith review was conducted in 2017, and it was a review of the workplace conducted by the government. And it was really looking at the business case for equality and diversity. And it found that people from different experiences brought much richer creativity, better problem solving, greater flexibility just to their thinking. At the academic side of this, it's a bit light. And these are two of the examples that are very powerful. It's partly why we've commissioned somebody to do a PhD in this whole issue. Notwithstanding, the anecdotal evidence is very clear to me, at least, that diverse boards make better decisions, even if the process of getting to that decision can sometimes be a little bit more tortuous. It's always worth it. And the reason it's worth it is because you want the best decisions to be made so that you can deliver your charitable objectives in the best way possible. And often having a diverse board really enables you to do that. There is another dimension, and it's particularly important if your organization is working with a particular group of beneficiaries. And there's a case to be made that for your organization to be legitimate, truly legitimate, it needs to reflect those on the board that it's seeking to serve. And finally, I think why boards should consider diversity is it's fun when you're with people who are from different walks of life and different backgrounds. It's always going to be a much more interesting experience. I chair a national children's charity, and we recently had an away day, and we did panic rooms together. We did cocktail making. We did all sorts of things, and I couldn't be more different to a lot of the other trustees, and it was a great time. So let's not forget the fun element of having a great mixed board. What's the current state of diversity? Well, 8% of trustees are from an ethnic background compared to a much bigger proportion of the population. 2% of charities have a trustee who's under the age of 24. The average age of a trustee is 60. 1 in 5 charity trustees is called David or John. I find this statistic very entertaining. And 40% of trustees are women. And so there's much work to be done. Recent research by Ecclesiastical has suggested that of the 250 charities surveyed, only 50% said they were actively seeking trustees from a more diverse range of backgrounds, and that's a significant drop from the previous year. So that could mean that boards are actually doing much better and they're not having to put as much emphasis on it. However, it also found in the same research that 58% of charities believed their board was made up of trustees from a diverse range of backgrounds, compared to a much higher figure a few years before. So perhaps it's not as good as we think it is. So for your organization, consider how are you doing when it comes to diversity? Is that an important consideration or not? And if it is, there are some very practical things that you can do to help make it better. The final thing I want to talk about is the issue of developing trustees and then succession planning, because I think these areas are, as I said at the beginning, we place a lot of effort, a great deal of time and energy often goes into recruiting trustees. And the last thing we want is for those individuals to come in and then revolve out 6 months later. And that's disruptive and it's not good for anybody. So one of the things to think about is induction and what makes for a really good induction. And I think there are a few things. So having meetings with other trustees, having meetings with members of staff if you have employees. What about engaging service users? Sometimes that doesn't happen, but that can be one of the most powerful things for a new trustee to come in and suddenly start to experience and work with the people that the organization is set up. So think about the meetings. Think about what events the new trustee can join. Think about what documents that new trustee would really benefit from having. So there are a few documents that spring to my mind. Your article of association or your governing instrument, as I mentioned earlier, is such a fundamentally important document that I'm sure all of your trustees know back to front, and probably it should be made available to potential trustees even before they join, but certainly when they do join, they really need to have a look at your articles. What about minutes of your previous few board meetings? Think about financial information you want to share. And often we just present people with the latest statutory set of accounts, but that's quite rear view mirror, that's quite retrospective. So much more helpful is to share current set of management accounts. So that could include your balance sheet position. So cash flow forecasts increasingly important, particularly with the the cost of living crisis. Many charities now are having to not produce 6 monthly cash flow forecasts, but actually, in some cases, even weekly. And so think about what financial information to share. We talked about a code of conduct earlier. It could have come up during your interview process. You may have included a link or a reference to it in your candidate information pack or advert, but you want to make sure that as part of the induction, your new trustees have that code of conduct. And the strategic plan, of course, if you have one. People need to join the board, really aware of the direction of travel, where you're heading. I think recognize that a new trustee is not necessarily going to have a big impact on the very first board meeting. In fact, I would always be skeptical of a trustee who at the very first board meeting dominates the conversation. That is clearly not right. Research has suggested that it takes 18 months for a non-executive to start really adding value. Somehow I think that's a little bit too long, but just recognize it does take people a while, even with all this information, to really get up to speed. Think about training and providing training for your new trustees. There are lots of sources of training. The National Council for Voluntary Organisations, for example, has some fantastic training options where it deep dives into specific issues. I know that this programme of Transforming Governance, there's been some fantastic programs of training. But sometimes training also you can find from law firms, and you'll find that a lot of the law firms that work in the charity sector or the wider arts sector will often have a series of presentations, whether it be on changes to the Charities Act, whether it be on things such as trademark law, whether it be on all kinds of employment things, and normally those things are free. So think about the training of your new trustees and your existing trustees. What about mentoring? This is something that's not talked about very much, but mentoring for new trustees and for long-standing trustees can be extremely beneficial. I remember many years ago, and Tom won't mind me mentioning this because he's let me share it before. We recruited a trustee, a chap called Tom, to join the board of Christian Aid. So not an arts charity, but a very large charity. And he really struggled because he was an oil and gas man working for British Gas. And every other trustee was a practicing clergyman or ex-clergyman. And what Tom realized was that banging his fist on the table, trying to get his point across, was not working. And so for a year, we provided a mentor for him who really supported him. And it was a safe space where Tom could share what he was learning and to think through strategies for being more impactful as a trustee. And after 12 months, it was brilliant. He was firing on all four cylinders. He was having a real impact. And I think the big thing for me was I went to see the group HR director of Centrica, and just because I knew her, and said, "How's Tom getting on?" And she said, "This trusteeship that he's been involved with has been absolutely brilliant for him, because we're grooming him to join the main board of Centrica at some point in the future. But being on this board, all those rough edges of how to communicate with different people and interact and prep and plan, he's really come on leaps and bounds." So think about mentoring. We actually have something called Thrive on Board, where we provide mentors for trustees, or coaching for really experienced trustees. Think about appraisals. Again, you want to have a board that is really high performing. And whilst the board will make lots of mistakes and will never be perfect, I'm a firm believer that boards should be constantly seeking to be better and better each and every year. And one of the ways you do that is by having a really good appraisal process in place. And that's appraisals for the trustees, but also an appraisal for the chair. And I've seen lots of different ways of this being handled and done. There isn't a magic bullet that fixes everything, but at a simple, most simple level, and I think sometimes we can overcomplicate these things. What I do with the charity that I chair is every January and February, roughly, I agree with all of the trustees. I'm going to have a simple conversation with them and just catch up and ask them some simple questions. Do you feel you're getting enough information from the charity to help you with your decision making? How do you feel that your contribution is? And perhaps is there anything we can do to help you be more effective as a trustee? And those three simple questions really help individuals to think through their own contribution to the board. For the chair, sometimes having a 360 or a anonymous survey done of the other trustees, how they feel about the chair, also can be super helpful, and that can often be led by the vice chair or an independent third party, which brings me on to board reviews. And the question is, do you do board reviews as an organization? You can really overcomplicate it, or you can do really simple things. I mentioned the Charity Governance Code earlier. Again, you can make that quite a sophisticated process, or you can simply have the principles and as a board just discuss how are we doing against those principles. Are there things we need to be working on? You can take it a little bit further, and I've done this with charities I've been involved with, where we've brought in maybe every 3 years a independent third party to maybe sit and watch the board in action, and to conduct a survey of individual board members, and to triangulate and bring all that information together to really see how are we doing as a board, and give us some perspective there. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about succession planning, because having wonderful boards is so important, but having depth in those boards is equally important. And so one of the mistakes I've seen is that when a charity recruits a lot of trustees in one go, and they all have fixed terms of office, and then they all exit at the same point, and you're left without that corporate knowledge, that corporate history. So think about how you recruit trustees, and whether it's better to have a staggered and staged plan to help recruit, so that you're not bringing them all in one go and losing them all in one go. Think about, do you have people in your current board who could step up and become chair? And many organizations we get involved with have what looks like a good board, but there's no depth to it. And when the chair leaves, there's nobody else ready to take up the chair role. So something to consider in your recruitment process is to have either in the back of your mind, or be quite intentional, that we are recruiting trustees. We're not recruiting a chair. However, we recognize that the existing chair is going to be leaving in 2 years or 3 years. And with our recruitment, we want to have an eye on someone that potentially could take over as chair. And I've certainly been involved in recruitment processes where that's been quite specifically mentioned. What about appointing vice chairs within the organization? Do you have one? What about a radical suggestion of having everybody as a vice chair and they all have a different responsibility? So you could have a vice chair for safeguarding, a vice chair for finance, a vice chair for risk. So that's something you might consider. What about giving other people the opportunity to chair the organization? Perhaps you could have a rotating chair where every board meeting, the chairing of that meeting is passed, the baton is passed on to somebody else. Or perhaps every 6 months it's passed on to somebody else. And so just some things to think about in terms of building depth and building real resilience in your board. The other thing to think about is, of course, these shadow boards that I mentioned earlier, or advisory groups, or people on committees who are not actually trustees, people that potentially could step into the board role as appropriate. So we've covered quite a few things in the 50 minutes we've had so far. We've looked at some of the basic principles of recruiting trustees. Really importantly, a lot of the spade work that you need to do, the hard work, the thinking, the talking, the debating, even before you go and you start advertising to try and find some trustees. We've talked about some of the practical actions, such as board audits, skills audits, making sure you know what your governing document actually says. We've talked about removing barriers and thinking about the language and how you reach out to a much wider group of people. We've talked a bit about the process and fundamentally having a really compelling advert out there so people resonate with it, they're captured by it, they want to find out more. Making sure you've got a very clearly thought out search strategy with timelines, you know exactly where you're going to go. You may want to engage a professional firm if you can afford it. If not, that's not a problem. There are still other things you can do. And really give some thought to the interviews and how you're going to assess candidates and compare candidates. And then crucially, how do you induct them? So important to get them on board and to keep them on board. So train, mentor, appraise, review your board, keep striving for better and better. And then finally, we've talked a bit about succession planning. I just want to finish this section before we go into a well-deserved break, and that's a quote from Beveridge, who founded the welfare state, and he talked about charity, and when I say charity, the arts, volunteerism, all of these things as being like a golden thread that runs through our national story. Such an important part of our social fabric and our history. And to be a trustee is to be a custodian of that wonderful tradition. And long after we're all dead and gone, our organizations hopefully will continue to offer the wonderful things that they do to our communities and the people we serve. It's incumbent on us to really protect that role of trusteeship, to do the very best we can to recruit the very best trustees, but then to keep them and develop them and nurture them and to build that resilience within our organization. So I've gone a minute over that I was supposed to. I know there's a lot of information there, and we're going to have some time for some questions. We've also got, when we come back, a little task for everyone to talk about in groups. But for now, I think I'm going to hand back over to Holly, who's going to give us our comfort break.
I can't see myself, but I'm hoping people can hear and see. Excellent. Great. Yeah, thanks ever so much. We will have a 10-minute break. So we'll come back at, we'll start again at 3:01. And Ian will just put up the question for the breakout groups, and we'll go straight into breakout groups once Ian's introduced that. So see you in 10 minutes. Okay, it's 1 minute past or 2 minutes past. So I'm going to hand back over to Ian, who's just going to introduce the breakout sessions, and then you will be whisked away into a group afterwards. So thanks.
Thanks, Holly. Well, I hope you had a well-deserved comfort break. I recognise we have covered a huge amount of ground, and thank you for some of the questions which I've been making notes of and will try to address when we come back in 10 minutes or so. I think the value of these sorts of sessions is to go away and think about, is there one practical thing that we might as an organisation do to improve the way either we recruit trustees or think about trustee recruitment or develop our boards. And so this is a really simple breakout session, but in your groups, please do just discuss what's one practical thing you think you can do or take away from the presentation today. So we're gonna break out for, I think, about 10 minutes, Holly, maybe 12 minutes, and then we'll come back and tackle any questions that are remaining. So Holly, over to you, I guess.
Great. Sorry, I think my video is being a bit slow, but yes, we will probably, you'll have just over 10 minutes. And I'm hoping, I'm staring at my screen, you'll be whisked away in just a moment into breakout groups. So we'll see you back at 15:15.
Great. Welcome back, everybody. And thank you once again to Claire and Harry for keeping up with me, probably talking too fast. Great to have you back. We don't need to use up the full 15 minutes we have left. However, it would be really helpful if you were inclined to share maybe some of the key points or questions you have in the chat box. Personally, I find it very interesting to see what things you're taking away. Whilst you're thinking about doing that, I just want to pick up on some of the questions that I know have already been addressed, but they have prompted some other thoughts from me, and I will share some of those with you now. In terms of the appraisals for your board members, clearly there are very different ways you can do that. The questions that I like to ask my trustees are, broadly speaking, these 4 questions. The first is, do you feel that you've been provided with enough information to enable you to fulfill your role as a trustee? And we do find, and I've certainly found, that sometimes you can have too much information or too little. And so that's a good question. Secondly, getting people's perception on how the charity is actually doing and getting them to share confidentially with you as the chair. Thirdly, it's about the reflection on their own performance. So how do they value their own contribution? And the fourth area, which I failed to mention, but I think is really important, is, are there any areas where we can support you as a trustee in your development? And that's a really great opportunity for issues such as mentoring or further training to come up. So hopefully that's helpful on the appraisal side. With the young trustee movement, I see that the link has already been shared with you. You know, that organization has over 4,000 followers. They do some fantastic events, and I do think you can post your vacancies on their LinkedIn group. So well worth considering. One thing that I didn't discuss in any detail, but I thought I would mention now, is about how you actually go and interview your potential trustee candidates and the sorts of questions that you might be asking. And I think there are 4 fundamental things that I always look for when I interview potential trustee candidates. So one is motivation, and really seeking to understand why they want to engage with your organization. Unfortunately, there are people who want to join a board, particularly if it's a fairly well-known organization, not because of the objectives of the organization, but because of the halo effect it confers upon them for being involved with your organization, and they are not the people you want on the board. So really important to test motivation. I think on the motivation side as well, sometimes people can be too emotionally invested or connected to a particular organization, and sometimes that prohibits them being really objective. So some things to think about when you're testing that. Secondly, of course, where can they add value? And you want people to be able to demonstrate the professional skills that they bring to the table, as well as some of the soft skills. On the soft skills, I always like to understand people's approach to teamwork. And as you know, a good board will have different groups of people on there. And so what you really need are people that are a little bit more sophisticated in terms of their ability to interact and work with others. So testing people's behaviors if you can. And then I think the final thing I always look for is just some clarity over their understanding of the role. And one doesn't expect people to have all read, for example, the Charity Commission CC3 guidance on the 6 fundamental duties of trusteeship. But you would hope that most people applying for a trustee role have some understanding of what's required. Crucially, if your organization has any scale, the role of a non-exec versus an executive role. But I'd also recognize that many organizations are very small, and the trustees wear 2 hats, both a strategic governance hat, but also sometimes a bit more tactical and operational. But you want to test those things. So there were a few reflections from me. I'm just having a quick look at some of the notes here to make sure I've addressed everything. Yeah, you can work hard to bring your trustee opportunity to the worries. How can you be confident that when you join the board, they're going to pull their weight? Yeah, that's a really good question from Doric. Good HR practice, and this applies, by the way, to executive hires as well. Good HR practice says that the more steps you put in a process, the more likelihood the outcome at the end is going to be better. And I think there's something about being very clear up front. I go back to my point about the advert and the candidate information back, explaining what are the expectations, and that at every step of the process, whether it be interviews with a headhunter, interviews with yourself, informal meetings, that point about commitment being really, really stressed. Some organizations keep a register of attendance. Some organizations include that in their annual report and accounts that's published and in the public domain, even to the subcommittee level that, you know, Johnny is on the finance committee, but he's only turned up once this year out of 4 or 5 meetings. So you may have your own ideas. A code of conduct for the trustees could be really helpful here, where you stay, and I've said this to a charity I was involved with once, if you miss 3 board meetings in a row without good reason, you know, you're off. And so again, check your governing instruments and what you can and can't do. But I think if you can stress those things, you've got plenty of opportunities. Robert, our group discussed the issue of remunerating trustees. And the session of the yeah, that's a really interesting point. Remunerating trustees is very contentious depending who you speak with. Charity law talks about trustees not being remunerated unless you get dispensation or permission from the Charity Commission, which is often quite hard to do. Some people say that remunerating trustees rips the voluntary spirit out of trusteeship. I don't necessarily agree with that. There's an argument for perhaps remunerating trustees that really can't afford it. So if you know, you're a young person or you're maybe a single parent or something like that. But again, that then creates issues around fairness for all. I came across one organization where the chair was paid £10,000 a year and the trustees weren't paid anything. I just thought that was terrible. So it's a really good point. It's a live discussion. There isn't a clear answer. And there also isn't actually the evidence to say that just because you pay trustees, you're going to get a better outcome. Housing associations have been paying their board members for the last 15 years or so. and I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that the performance of the boards has improved. I'm kind of on the fence with it. I can see an absolute case for it, and I can understand why some people are against it, but I don't think it's as simple as just saying we're going to do it. Question: only 10% of, oh, I've just lost it. Okay, only 10% of charities without open recruitment. Do you know either the success rate? Well, that's a really good point. I think there's very little data on this, on the issue of success rate of open recruitment and why others don't. What I have recognized is that if we take the broader charity sector, so not just the arts sector, we're talking about 165,000 charities in England and Wales, of which 97% have an income less than £1 million a year. And the reality is that if you're a really small organisation, and most of that 97% are less than £100,000 a year, having the resources and the wherewithal to run an open recruitment process is actually not on people's mind. So I think for a lot of organisations, either they don't have the capacity, or it's held together by a shoestring and a few volunteers. So I think that's the reason why a lot of people don't do it. It's very rare now for larger organisations to not recruit openly, and often there's an expectation from their funders that they do that. And increasingly, even in places like the sports sector, the governing bodies are under pressure to make sure they are being transparent and open as much as possible. Do we know the success rate? No, there are no metrics on that. It's a very fragmented industry. There isn't one place where all these opportunities are advertised. If you went on our website, you'd find about 66 adverts today. If you went on Reach Volunteering, you'd find probably another 100 or so. But I think the chances of being successful are much higher when the recruitment is much more open. I'm interested in this too. In the breakup discussions, we'd all done it, found it unsuccessful and disheartening. Yeah, that's. I think that's partly to. I'm sorry to hear that. I think that's partly to do with it's supply and demand. It's very fragmented. So a lot of people who do know what trusteeship is don't know where to look, and we need to do better as a sector. To reach out, ditto, and we hit much of a good practice here. Yeah, it's a bit hit and miss. I've just done a piece of work today actually for an organisation based in a very small geographic area near Stafford, and because they've engaged our services, we were able to delve into some of the tools that we have and reach out to about 200 people who lived within 6 miles of Stafford town centre, and we've already got some real interest in the role. I think it depends who you engage with and whether you can afford to, invest a little bit in that process. But it's not easy. In our experience, open recruitment has been very resource heavy. Yeah, and that goes back to the point, Sarah. I think why some organisations don't do it. I think in time, what we will find is that as more organisations start to advertise it publicly, and as more individuals come forward to say we really want to engage and become trustees, you'll find the supply and demand will get better and better, and the matching will get easier and easier. Just to try and be a little bit positive, we run a program called Step on Board, and we run that with big multinationals. We're currently working with 17 organizations such as KPMG, Deloitte, EY, Google, Barclays, and lots of others. And what we have found is that there is absolute demand from professional people wanting to become trustees, but they haven't got a clue where to go to find them. And so that gives me great heart that there is a wonderful supply of people out there. We've just got to find a better way of marrying them up.
Collective Open Recruitment Arts Organisation in Leicester. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I know in places like East London, there's something called the East London Business Alliance that brings together lots of charities from, I think it's basically Tower Hamlets, and they will meet together. They'll often pair up with some of the big corporates, and they'll have some speed dating to try and organise some things. There's no reason why something like that couldn't be done in Exeter or geographically. I think it's a terrific idea, and if we can help, then we'd love to. I recognise we've come to the end of our time, Holly. It feels like there's so much more we could talk about, and thank you everybody for sticking with us and for engaging so powerfully in this really important subject. I know it's not easy, and for some organisations it's easier than others, but I think as a sector, as we continue to grow the supply of trustees and we get better at matching with demand, hopefully in the years to come, it will become much less painful for some of us. So thank you so much. Holly, I'd better hand over to you.
That's great. Yeah, thank you very much. A big thank you to Ian from Trustees Unlimited for the session today. And we will be following up. There'll be an email with the written answers to questions and the slides and a recording. I think it takes us a few days just to organise everything, but that will be with you as soon as we can. So thank you very much for joining us, and yeah, have a good day.